Support for WUWM podcast comes from Hop Harvest and Vine and Good Harvest Market in Milwaukee, part of One Destination, combining farm-to-table dining, local craft beers, and organic groceries under one roof. More at goodharvestmarket.com.
You're listening to Lake Effect Spotlight from WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR station. Here's one of our favorite conversations about what's happening in the city.
Bubbler Talk, quenching Milwaukee's thirst for knowledge.
I'm WUWM's Audrey Nowakowski, and this week's Bubbler Talk takes us to a centuries-old hidden gem at a college campus in downtown Milwaukee.
Yeah, I'm Eric Shane. My Bubbler Talk question is just wanting to know a little more about the St. Joan of Arc Chapel on the Marquette campus.
The Gothic stone chapel certainly stands out among the campus's mix of more modern buildings. While Marquette has been around since 1881, this building is just a bit older than that.
It was first built in the city of Lyon about 1420. It was known as Saint Martin de Sissois, and it was a private family chapel.
That's Robert Newman, a guide at the St. Joan of Arc Chapel. So why is a 600-year-old chapel in the middle of a Milwaukee college campus? And what does it have to do with Joan of Arc? It's kind of a wild ride, so let's start with its first home. The chapel originally served the community of Châteauroux southeast of Lyon, France for over 400 years before falling into disrepair. Although it wasn't in top shape, it still caught the eye of an American who would bring it back to life in the 1920s.
Enter a wealthy patroness, Gertrude Gavin, and her husband Michael Gavin wanted a chapel on their private Long Island estate. And they were very high in Catholic laity, not only because of philanthropy, but also because of the works they did themselves. So they arranged with the Archdiocese of Lyon to have the chapel deconstructed, what was left of it, stone by stone, and rebuilt on Oyster Bay, Long Island.
That's right. The Gavins had the chapel deconstructed and shipped in parts to New York. Gertrude came from railroad money, so I guess that's the kind of thing you can do with obscene wealth. The chapel was going to be next to a French Renaissance chateau the Gavins also purchased and shipped and reassembled from France. To help honor the chapel's style when it was rebuilt, Newman says that Gertrude Gavin hired Boston artist Charles Connick, an expert in medieval French-style stained glass, to create the windows for the chapel.
He agreed to the commission, but he traveled to France for almost a year for two purposes: for inspiration from churches that Joan prayed at, or also from churches she may have prayed at that were around, and to study the art. But he also went to patrimony, exclusive warehouses in France, and purchased glass from medieval French churches so that the color would be authentic and identical to the colors, the blues, the reds, the greens that Joan had seen in the 15th century. Those were incorporated into the chapel in the 1920s, so the claim can be made Joan saw those exact images.
Other objects were added to the chapel when it was reconstructed in Long Island, such as a 13th century altar from Ireland, 15th century wooden beams from France, wooden art pieces, and more to restore it to a functioning place of worship on the Gavins' private property. Now, for the chapel's current namesake, St. Joan of Arc. Originally, the chapel was named after St. Martin, but around the time Gertrude Gavin was rebuilding it at her home, Joan of Arc was being canonized. Here's Dr. Jennifer Vanderheyden, Associate Professor of French and Francophone Studies at Marquette.
We should say when talking about Joan of Arc, there's always the caveat that there's the legend, there's the actual person who did exist, but there are not a lot of public records at the time.
Joan of Arc is the French heroine of the 100 Years' War between England and France in the Middle Ages. She grew up in a small French town that, like many others, was ravaged by the English.
The legend is that she was a peasant girl and keeping the sheep. That probably is not true. Her father did have a function in Domremy as far as, I think he was a tax collector. So they were of minimal means, but they weren't destitute by any means. And she was happy there, but she was very religious. And then she started hearing voices of mainly of three saints that were telling her through God that she was to lead this mission to save France and to go free the city of Orléans.
Joan led the French army to key victories, securing the coronation of Charles VII. But she was captured by the English, convicted of heresy, and burned at the stake. She was only 19. Dr. Vander Hayden says Joan of Arc is an early example of a feminist, though that term didn't exist during the Middle Ages. She was a woman boldly breaking her society's rules around gender.
She was most of all and foremost very religious. I mean, it was a divine mission. If she needed to wear men's clothing in battle, it was practical, obviously. She was captured and accused of heresy, and the wearing of the men's clothes had a lot to do with that accusation. Her mission was divine and patriotic, and that was the aspect of standing up, being independent. She couldn't read or write, so it's not as if she wrote a manifesto, but her words during the trial are also very clear that she obeyed God.
Joan of Arc was posthumously retried and vindicated. She officially became the patron saint of France in 1920. Gertrude Gavin was so captivated by Joan of Arc that she wanted to rename the medieval chapel, the one she had shipped to her New York home, in Joan's honor. Chapel guide Newman explains how she accomplished this.
The Gavins, they petitioned the Archbishop of Brooklyn for permission to rename the chapel from St. Martin to St. Joan. And said, you got to do better. Okay, that's where the stone comes into play.
The stone that he's referring to is called the Joan of Arc stone. It was from a Marian grotto, an outdoor shrine dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Legend has it that Joan stopped to pray there during her travels.
And so she's praying, she finishes her prayers, she kisses the stone, the ground stone that she was laying upon, and then she gets on her horse, a war horse, not a pony, slaps her gauntlet and says, "Go forth boldly." And they go on to the day. And that stone was acquired from a Marian grotto that was being demolished or dismantled, I'm unsure, in the 1920s. The bishop from that region contacted the Gavins and said, "We think you want to put this stone into your chapel." In other words, incorporate it into the building, because then the claim can be made that Joan prayed here.
I had heard the lore that the stone in the Joan of Arc chapel is a cooler temperature year-round, no matter the season. Newman says some Marquette students looked into it back when the chapel was reconstructed on the campus in the 1960s.
Now, this is legend. I don't see documentation of this. The mechanical engineering students were the first ones to insist on measurement. So they brought their devices and their tools, and they measured the temperature of the stone. And their findings were that the stone where Joan kissed and wept upon is always about 3 degrees cooler. Now, it's been since measured by the physics department using high tech, and it's always cooler.
Want to try it? Yeah. Curious if you
Just
can
use
feel
the
a
skin
difference.
right here.
Yeah.
And touch any of the stone.
Oh, yeah. No, you can definitely. Yeah.
So how did the chapel end up at Marquette? Well, Gertrude Gavin's estate was purchased by a couple named Mark and Lillian Rotman in 1962. But there was a fire on the property, and everything was lost, except the chapel. The Rotmans wondered who could benefit from what was left. Turns out Lillian Rotman had a relationship with the Haggerty Museum of Art at Marquette.
So it was decided to gift it to Marquette. So after the fire, the chapel was deconstructed stone by stone, loaded onto a truck, cataloged, and brought right where we're sitting right now.
Remember, this is the second time the chapel was deconstructed and moved to a new home. It took workers 9 months to carefully take it apart before it was rebuilt on Marquette's campus. As it was reassembled, some changes were made to add modern conveniences like heat and electricity. It's a mix of ancient and not so ancient.
The nave was elongated when it was first built here in 1966, and again elongated in 2018. So the farther you get away from the main altar area, it becomes more of Wisconsin. So the stone on the outside of the building is Lannon stone from Menominee Falls. Okay, the doors is modern hardware, but the original hardware and the original woodwork is from France. The bench you're sitting on now is from 1640s. Not made at IKEA, it's not going to fall on you. And that was from Normandy, France. So things were bought from other areas and brought in. The altar is a 13th century altar from Ireland. The woodwork on the ceiling is a blending of beams from France from the 15th century and beams from Douglas fir from northern Wisconsin. From where you sit, you can see these beautiful Gothic arches. That's all original stone.
The first shipment of the twice disassembled chapel arrived in Milwaukee on January 31st, 1965, and the chapel officially opened in 1966. Since then, it has served as the heart of the Marquette campus and community. French professor Dr. Vanderheyden explains what it means to her.
I developed an entire course on Joan of Arc, and it was really interesting because to see how much the students, they love the chapel, they love to come to Mass, but a lot of the history they don't really study normally, and we had the first class here. And it's very nice because you don't have all the technical additions, and so we can just sit here and read a text and talk about Joan of Arc.
And Chapel Guide Newman shares what Father Fred Zagone, the University Advancement Chaplain, says about the chapel.
Father Fred Zagone would always want me to say, if you don't say anything, say this. It's the heart of the Marquette campus, and it's also the oldest building in the Western Hemisphere still being used for its design purpose. Sounds like a Jeopardy question, but that's the chapel.
There are Catholic Masses at the St. Joan of Arc Chapel every day during the school year. Visitors are welcome during or outside of Mass. After spending some time at the chapel with Eric Shane, who submitted the Bubbler Talk question about it, I asked what stood out to him.
Finding out that this is the oldest still functioning structure in the Western Hemisphere is amazing. Yeah, there is definitely a reverence here that's going on that you can feel.
For Lake Effect, I'm Audrey Nowakowski.
Send us your Bubbler Talk question and join us Thursday, February 26th at Ope Brewing for Bubbler Talk Trivia. Details are at WUWM.com.
That was the Lake Effect Spotlight podcast. It comes from WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR station. Lake Effect is WUWM's talk show all about what's happening in the city. If you want to hear more conversations like this, subscribe to the Lake Effect Spotlight podcast, and you'll hear highlights from the show. If you want to hear the full show, it's on the radio at noon, Monday through Friday, on 89.7